record. Okay, I'm gonna let them in.
Hi, everyone. Just going to give it a second before we start and kick off the program. Thank you all for being here. We'll be kicking off in just a moment. Alrighty. Now, as people are trickling in, I'm excited to welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar, Swiping, Matching, Verifying, Researching Online Dating in the Age of AI. My name is Alex Bob Davies. I'm a member of our Central Alumni Engagement team here at Boston University. We appreciate everyone joining us today. This event is co-sponsored by the BU Women's Affinity Network and the Boston University Women's Leadership Council. More information about these groups can be found on BU Connects, and we will send you those links as follow-up to today's webinar. Before diving in, a few housekeeping notes. Today's presentation is being recorded, as you'll see at the top of your screen, and the recording of this webinar will soon be available for on-demand viewing on the Alumni and Friends website found at www.bu.edu/alumni. You will receive an email with a link once it's live on the website. And we encourage you, for those that are joining us live today, to submit any questions you have during the presentation using the Q&A function, which can be found in the Zoom toolbar. Today's speaker, Katy Coduto, is an assistant professor of media science in the Department of Mass Communication, Advertising, and Public Relations. Katy researches the intersections of mass media and interpersonal communication, focusing on how individuals use media to connect with one another and make sense of the world around them. Recent studies have investigated the complex decisions individuals make when online dating and compulsive social media are used during major news events. Her work has been published in journals including the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, Computers and Human Behavior, Psychology of Popular Media, and the Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media. Katy teaches courses in research methods, social media analysis, and media effects. Prior to receiving her PhD from Ohio State, Katy worked as a research analyst and strategist for Marcus Thomas LLC, an integrated marketing communications company in Cleveland, Ohio. Thank you so much, Katy, for leading us in this wonderful conversation, and I will turn the mic over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us for this chat today. I'm very excited to share some of the work I've done in online dating. Like we said, I'm Katy Coduto. I teach in the College of Communication, and I research all kinds of online behaviors. So I'm really interested in how people act on social media kind of broadly. And my specialty area is online dating. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. Now, just to give you an idea of what we'll be talking about, we're actually just going to start by looking at what are some of the basics. I'm sure some of you have tried online dating, but maybe there are some of you who kind of missed that chance for whatever reason. So we'll take a look at some of the apps, what people are thinking about them, and maybe you're joining this just thinking like, why do people even use these apps? And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And so with that, we'll go from the basics to some current issues in online dating, things that I have noticed in my own research that people are maybe concerned about, but also maybe a little optimistic about. And then, of course, we'll talk about the age of artificial intelligence. So how is AI kind of coming into the dating app and online dating scene? We'll talk a little bit about what's next. So where do we go from here with all of this information? And then, of course, there will be plenty of time for Q&A because I would just love to hear, what are you thinking about or what more do you want to know? So let's jump right in. And I'm going to tell you that, some of this might seem obvious, again, especially if you've been an online dating user, but when I teach, I like to make sure that my students are all on the same page with definitions, that we know exactly what we're all talking about. And so we're going to do the exact same thing here. So when we're talking about online dating, we're talking about platforms that are enabling connection between people, typically romantic connection, but people download dating apps and sign up to online dating sites for all kinds of reasons. People in my research want things, from marriage all the way to friendship, and of course, more casual interactions as well. These, again, are both desktop and mobile, but as you might expect, mobile is increasingly dominant. So if we look back at the history of online dating, you might think about eHarmony, Match.com, those different websites that started off, you had to log on to a computer, you could only get access to them at a designated time maybe in your day. Whereas now, when we talk about apps, we're talking about a technology that can be accessed anytime, anywhere. And a big thing I want to make sure that we're thinking about is the fact that these have a swipe to match interface, or most of them do. And what we mean by that is that you literally swipe on different people's profiles to indicate interest or not. So in many of these apps, and part of what has made dating apps so popular is the fact that you swipe left to say, no, I'm not interested, or swipe right to say, I am interested in someone. And then when you both swipe right, that indicates mutual interest. And so we're going to swipe right now. So just to give you a further idea of these interfaces, I wanted to actually show you what some of them look like. And so first we'll take a look at Hinge here. And what you will probably notice right away is that this is a very photo-focused experience. And that's true for pretty much all of the apps and the online sites themselves. And that makes sense because when we think about attraction, most of the time we're looking at someone's physical features first, and that's true online and in person. And so that really carries over to the app experience. So here we have emphasis on a photo. You can choose when you're building a profile, which one you want people to see first versus which ones they might have to kind of scroll through to see more. Other information that can appear on these profiles includes age, location, education, and job. What you'll also notice though with Hinge is that they have these little prompts here. And these make it easier for people to start conversations, which we'll talk a lot more about when we look at AI. But this is part of why I chose Hinge, is because this is a little different from some of the other applications. So if you think about things like Tinder or Bumble, those really tend to emphasize that age, location, maybe education or job. So those kinds of basics about someone. Hinge tends to go a little deeper, and of the applications available, Hinge is doing pretty well. Now, the other thing I wanted you to see is kind of what that swipe feature looks like in action. I love this little GIF. And so you can see we have our fake app Timber here. And that's basically what it looks like, is you are presented with a series of photos and you can swipe pretty quickly through them. To give you an idea, people that I have interviewed about online dating, about dating apps, will look for less than a second at some potential partners. So this is not something that everyone is taking their time with by any means. Now, the other element of dating apps that I don't have here, but because I think it's something we all have an idea of what it looks like, is they all have built-in messaging. So once you've indicated that mutual interest, you've both swiped right, it'll take you to in-app messaging, which looks just like SMS text messaging on your phone or iMessage, Android, all of those. And so that is one of the key elements of the online dating experience, is not just that you put a profile together and present yourself, not just that you can indicate that mutual interest, but then you can actually connect and talk to someone as well. And so dating apps are interesting because they're facilitating multiple points of the dating experience. So let's get into some of the research now, right? We have our basics down. Just this past February, I led a survey with Ipsos and the College of Communication to understand some of these current perceptions of dating apps. So what do users think about the apps? This was a nationally representative survey of about 1,000 people. And what we saw is that 50%, so half of those respondents, were worried about chatbots overtaking dating apps. So people are really worried that they're interacting with robots or they're interacting with a fake version of someone. And as you might imagine, this will definitely come up when we get back to AI. What's interesting though, so we have this half that's really hesitant, right? Has this concern about chatbots, But then we also had 41% who said that, well, maybe you can find a soulmate on a dating app. But then we go back and people were also concerned about lying. And I think these results are really interesting because what we're seeing here is that people have concerns about online dating, but they also still have hope. There's a sense of, well, why wouldn't I at least have an app, right? Like there's always that chance that there could be someone there. And so what we're going to talk a lot about today are those tensions between, okay, how do I balance knowing that people might be lying, that they might not even be real, versus that potential, right, for a real exciting relationship. So jumping in then to some of these current issues. One of the key questions that guides my work really is, well, why do people look for relationships online? And like I said, this could be all kinds of relationships. We typically think of this about romantic, right, exclusive, monogamous relationships, but there are apps for all kinds of relationships, including polyamorous, including more casual. And so I think even that is interesting to dig into the different relationship types that people are looking for. And so that's kind of one key question. But then I also am curious about, well, how do people feel when they're using these apps, right? Like, are they getting what they want? Are they struggling? And how do they perceive the people that they're seeing? Ultimately, what we see in this space is that there's a lot of options, right? Whether it's a lot of apps, a lot of photos that you might present, a lot of messages you can send. At every stage of this, there's a lot of choice. And again, right, there are lots of concerns that accompany people. We saw that in the Ipsos research, but there's also concerns such as, well, who will see me? Right? So if you've used a dating app, maybe you've experienced this where you put your profile, but then you're like, oh, I don't know if I want a coworker to see me, or I don't know if I want my friends to know that I'm on a dating app yet, right? So there's that concern of just how visible am I to not just potential partners, but people that maybe I don't want to see me. Of course, there are questions around self-presentation, right? How do I kind of capture the essence of who I am for a dating partner? Of course, that big question of, well, is someone who they say they are? How do I know that the person I'm talking to really is that person? And if I meet up with them, will they be who they said they are? And then one question that I really want to dig into today is this question of, is someone too good to be true? And that goes hand in hand with, well, is someone who they say they are? But what you'll find is that actually in online dating, a lot of people tend to romanticize the people that they're seeing. And if we take a step back, we can think about this because we present ourselves, not just in online dating, but on Instagram or TikTok, LinkedIn even. We tend to present ourselves in really strong, positive ways. It's very rare that we would present something negative about ourselves. And so the same holds true for dating apps. And what happens is we carry those assumptions about our own self-presentation to how other people are presenting. And we start to think like, wow, this person looks really great. And so when people build these online dating profiles, they're building these versions of themselves that are just really perfect. And that's, of course, because they're trying to create that romantic connection. So just to give you an idea, I did a study where I actually had people come to a lab and chat with someone that they had never met before. So they literally each sat at a computer. They had no profile about the other person. They literally just had a text-based chat. And it was only about 20-25 minutes. After one chat interaction with really limited cues about the other person, they still came away feeling really positively about them, to the point where some people even said, like, yes, I idealize this person. I think they're really great. And that's because they had limited information about them and they started to fill in those gaps. And so, like I said, online daters typically don't highlight their flaws. They're typically trying to present themselves in ways that say, hey, I will make a good partner for one night or for a lifetime. And so what happens is swipers often end up feeling overly optimistic, which might sound good, but we'll talk about some of the drawbacks of that, right? Because on the one hand, if you're online dating and you're excited about who you're seeing, you're probably more open-minded, right? You're more open to different kinds of connections, of potential connections. The trade-off, of course, is that you might not be getting all of those connections. And of course, the other thing to keep in mind is that right? Your mileage may vary. So what one person finds to be ideal, another person might not. And that is kind of the classic fish pick that we see on dating apps, right? So for some people, they're like, oh, I would never. And for others, they're like, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So like I said, right, we have this sense that people, when they are online dating, they tend to feel relatively positively about the people that they match with. Doesn't mean that they love every single person or that they're, going to go on a date with every single person, but they fill in cues in ways that make them say like, okay, I'm at least excited about this one particular person. The trade-off though is that people might swipe too much. And so we're seeing a lot more conversation around dating app burnout. Now, another one of my key areas of research is called compulsive internet use. And of course, we can apply this to online dating, but take a minute and think about this, right? How many of us are constantly checking things like our email, our text messages, our social media? I am sure just in the 15 minutes or so that I've been talking so far, I have texts waiting for me, right? And so this is a behavior that many of us do. And it goes back to what we talked about with having our phones on us pretty constantly, right? Like my phone's just off to the side here. And so it's really easy to want to know what's going on, to want to check in. And this absolutely applies to dating apps. And it's why I pointed out the fact that apps are carrying people through multiple stages of interaction. So you get a notification when you get a match, you get a notification when you're getting messages, and that exacerbates compulsive internet users and checkers. And so one of my first studies in this area, I actually really wanted to understand this compulsive swiping behavior. What makes someone say like, oh, I have to check my phone. I have to know about, what's going on a given dating app. And what I found was that one of the key characteristics of people who were compulsive swipers is that they were lonely and they were socially anxious, usually together. So someone who was lonely but not as anxious, they might compulsively swipe, but they weren't necessarily relying just on dating apps. They might still feel like, oh, I could go in the world and try and make a connection. Same thing for socially anxious. Maybe if you're socially anxious but not as lonely, it wasn't quite as bad as if you experienced both of these together. So when someone was lonely and socially anxious, they were much more likely to compulsively swipe on any dating app. And what I found was that this led to increased negative outcomes for these people. And when we say negative outcomes, we're talking about things like choosing swiping over paying attention at work or getting into trouble in school. And I thought this was really interesting because for these people, they weren't lying about this, right? They were very honest in the survey that I did saying like, yeah, I am swiping when I should be taking notes for class or when I should be doing something at work. And so on the one hand, right, we have people having these really positive impressions. On the other, that's leading them to swipe a lot, right? And so that's kind of what we know so far is that ultimately people are really torn about this dating app experience. And again, maybe some of you have experienced that. There's a sense, that you could find a soulmate. There is always that sense of what if. And that's why so many people do keep the dating apps because they're easy. It's on your phone. So why not check and see who's there? But you could find a catfish. And for those of you who don't know, a catfish is someone who, maybe totally makes up a profile to be someone that they are not. And so people are torn. They are feeling like I could have a really great experience, but I could have a really negative experience. And then some people are constantly checking. They want to know what the latest notification is. They want to know if they have a new match, but it's not necessarily making them less lonely or anxious. And so a huge trend, like I mentioned a little bit ago, is that we're seeing much more dating app burnout. Some of this stems from the tensions themselves, right? If you are being overly positive, you're overly optimistic, you're matching with different people, you're saying like, oh, they seem really awesome, but then they're not meeting your expectations, that can lead to user burnout. You could also have it go the other way where you are swiping on a lot of people and you're just not feeling like you're seeing who you wanted to see. We see that a lot where it's like, oh, I'm going through this pool. And so users don't always find what they're looking for. This is getting worse as there are more and more dating apps available as well. So what we see is that people have Tinder, but they don't just have Tinder. They have Bumble, they have Hinge. Most online daters in my various surveys average about three accounts across dating app platforms. What that means though is that they are creating the same profile or a version of the same profile across three different platforms, and they are expecting different results, but those platforms are pulling from the same group of people. And that's something else that's really important to keep in mind when we talk about online dating is that both desktop and mobile, but particularly mobile options are focused on geolocation. So trying to connect you with a person who is relatively nearby. That way you can chat in the app, but then you can also meet in person. And so what happens is users download, three or four or however many different apps, and then they realize, oh, I'm still seeing the same people. And it's because they tend to be in the same physical location. And so that also leads to burnout, feeling like, oh, well, I thought I would see someone slightly different on Bumble or Hinge, and yet it's the same group of people, maybe just trying different opening lines or slightly different tweaks to their profiles. Another thing that is really kind of shaking up this industry right now is the fact that a lot of these dating apps are trying to introduce subscription models. We have subscriptions for everything, right? Whether it's Netflix, Hulu, all kinds of streaming services, but you can also have an Uber subscription, right? A DoorDash. Like there are all kinds of things that maybe they take $10 here, $10 there. And consumers are very sensitive to this kind of recurring charge. And the difference with something like a dating app versus Uber Eats, right, is Uber Eats, you're guaranteed a product from it. When you place an order, right, 90% of the time, maybe you lose an order here or there, but most of the time you're going to get something that, from that subscription. Dating apps, when they charge for a subscription, cannot guarantee a user a successful dating experience. They might say that, oh, we're going to show you more people or we're going to refine your experience, but they still can't, at the end of the day, guarantee that a single user will have a, single romantic connection. And so all of these combine to create dating app burnout. And what we have seen is this, right? Is that across all of these different companies, but particularly Match Group. So Match Group is kind of the behemoth in this space. It owns most of the dating apps, and of course, it's originally Match.com. But what we've seen just in the last couple of weeks with Match is that they cut a large portion of their staff, and they are not the only ones. If you look, Bumble has also struggled. It's lost market value since its IPO. And so dating app companies, of course, are trying to figure out, well, how do we mitigate this burnout? How do we create an experience that people both want to keep using, but then also want to pay for? And so at this point, you can probably see exactly where this is going. Of course, this is where AI comes into the conversation. As companies and users are trying to think about, how do I improve? How do I, if I'm the company, how do I get people to be interested, to stay on? But if I'm a user, right, how do I maybe present myself in better ways? And so as AI has taken off all around us, of course, it's taking off in this space as well. So let's revisit that Ipsos survey that, again, just from a couple months ago. One of the things that I did do was assess how people were feeling about AI. And so if you remember, people said, that they were really worried about chatbots, they were worried about lying. But what I also thought was interesting was that men were more optimistic about the potential for AI compared to women. Now, what I will also say is that numbers for both of these groups were still pretty low. So maybe some like hesitant optimism, but there was a significant gender difference, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. But so what we see are some of these kind of bigger concerns changing depending on gender identity and maybe what someone is looking for. The other thing that I don't have on this slide is that people were still very open-minded about the possibility of algorithms, which we'll talk about momentarily. And so again, the findings here are really mixed. There's a sense that maybe I could find something. Maybe AI could be good. Maybe the algorithms are good, but also maybe the algorithms aren't good, or maybe AI is a little dangerous. The other thing I will point out is that I'm trying to map these perceptions of AI in online dating over time. So we have actually collected this data with Ipsos in 2023 and 2024 as well. And so what I can tell you right now is that trends for the last 3 years regarding AI and online dating are pretty steady. There hasn't been like a great uptick in adoption of AI, at least in our survey respondents. But there also hasn't been kind of an increase in negative feelings either. It's kind of hovering in this middle ground of maybe I'm open to it, but maybe I'm still a little nervous about it. So just like we did with online dating, I do want to make sure that we are on the same page when we're talking about artificial intelligence, particularly in this space, because there's a lot of nuance to how it kind of develops and evolves and the different forms that it might take. And this is also why we are likely seeing some differences in how people feel about AI, because when we ask about AI as a blanket kind of technology, we're actually losing out on the different ways that it may manifest. So when we're looking at AI in online dating, we could first of all be talking about matching algorithms. So how is it that people are actually seeing each other? What is that kind of back end that says this person should see this person, or this person might be a good match for this person? We can also see AI in message writing. So is AI helping you write that kind of amazing opening line? Is it helping you respond to another message that you got, which we'll look at some of the technology for that shortly. Same thing, but with profile assistance. So is an AI helping you to kind of craft that perfect version of yourself? And then AI is also helping with photo editing. So artificial intelligence, it's not just this kind of behemoth monolith technology, but there are a lot of different ways that can manifest, and we're going to dig into those. And what's really exciting about this is, again, relatively new to this space. While the algorithms have been around for a while, we're really now seeing kind of that more user-centered AI come into focus. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is the idea of algorithmic artificial intelligence. So not just the fact that there are algorithms that help to match people, but people actually are starting to develop what scientists are calling algorithmic beliefs. And so what that means is that people will get on something like Tinder and they'll maybe pick Tinder and say, you know what, I have a lot of trust um, in this particular algorithm. I think this algorithm is going to help me see the people that I want to see. And maybe I don't feel that way about Bumble. What we mean when we say an algorithm is usually there is a combination of actions that you can take on a platform that will help a company, a platform, determine who you should see. And so maybe take a minute and think, but some of you have probably heard or maybe even said yourselves, like, oh, the algorithm doesn't really favor me, or the algorithm is suppressing me, or I'm doing really well with the algorithm, but I feel like we hear that a little less often. What is happening is that as you take certain actions, the company is essentially rewarding you. And so if you're a power user, for instance, so if you're someone who logs into Tinder every single day and you look at a couple profiles, you message a couple people, Tinder says, hey, that's someone that we should reward. We know that they're on this platform. We want to keep them on the platform. If you pay, right? So we go back to that subscription model, that adds a layer to the algorithm, to what you're telling the algorithm, right? So now you're not just a power user, but you're a paying power user. And so maybe you'll get rewarded even more. This ties back into that burnout feeling, though, because for a lot of people who don't want to pay, they might feel like, well, if I'm not paying, then the algorithm doesn't care about me. The algorithm's not going to show me anyone that I'm interested in. And so I don't care, right? I kind of give up on this. But again, what we're seeing is this increase in algorithmic beliefs, which I think is really interesting, that people are kind of assigning trust to a numbers system because that's all this is. And so I like this idea of like, is it serendipity? Maybe it's just artificial intelligence. It's not, it's a different kind of meet cute. And I keep thinking that, maybe we're not far from a rom-com with an AI meet cute. Maybe I'll write it someday. Now, going from algorithms to messages and profiles by AI, this is what we're kind of seeing again as the most common use case among users. So not just from the companies themselves trying to implement AI, but actually what users are interested in and more willing to adopt, right? So when we think about a user perspective in online dating, there are ways that we can manipulate algorithms. We can do it on anything, right? Not just online dating. You might manipulate your TikTok algorithm so that you get certain things in your For You page. But we don't necessarily get to go in and say like, okay, I'm going to tweak the algorithm perfectly. On the other hand, right, with messages and profiles, we have a lot of control. We can say this is exactly how I want to look or exactly how I want to sound. And so what I have on the screen here is one of the kind of first of these technologies, Riz, which literally comes from charisma, right? So if you have Riz, you have AI Riz now. And that is essentially a helper. And I think this is a really interesting question, right? So do you have an opening line that you write with AI, and is this helping or is it deception? If we think back to our Ipsos surveys, a lot of people would say, I don't know, this maybe feels like deception. And there's also that question of, well, just how much can AI help, right? Like at the end of the day, AI is using the input that you're giving it, right? Like you can't totally change yourself with AI. But like I said, I really wanted to point out here the way that this particular app works. So with Riz, you could give it a line or kind of tell it what you want to do, and then it'll give you a line, and then you can say, you know what, I actually think it should be funnier. Or, you know what, let's make it a little shorter. This feels maybe too overwhelming to the person I'm talking about. And so you can see here, right, then you can get a similar reply, but kind of tweaked to what you want. And so Riz is kind of taking off because it allows for this level of control while still feeling like a helper. Now, I want to take a step back because I think at this point it can feel like, I don't know, man, AI is a little, maybe this is too much, right? Maybe this feels a little uncanny, or maybe this makes you feel like, whew, I'm glad I'm not dating anymore. But I think it's really interesting to compare the new technologies we have to kind of, the way things were before technology kind of took over. And so, let's think about the fact that, friends often help each other in writing these type of messages, in looking at people's profiles. And of course, friends is kind of a broad term. It could be, family members, coworkers, essentially we have people help us with all kinds of things. And dating is kind of that classic case where typically friends are invested, they're helping. So if you've had a friend check a message before you sent it, or maybe edit a message before you sent it, I think that's really interesting to compare to. And I think then it's a matter of, well, are we bothered because it's losing a human touch? Or does it just feel a little uncomfortable now and maybe we'll adopt it sooner rather than later? I personally think that this is probably the best use case for AI right now in this space because it kind of marries what your consumers are used to or at least open to with something that they do actually want help with, right? Because when we look at dating, again, not just online, but kind of in all forms at all times, one of the hardest things for people to do is to really get that opening line, right? To say like something that is going to capture a potential partner's attention. One of my favorite things to do when I do this research, especially when I do interviews with people, if someone says, like, oh, I'm really not sure about meeting someone on a dating app, or I'm not sure about using AI to help me with an opening message, I usually say, well, how does that compare to a bar? Right? Like, is a bar as romantic as a dating app, for instance? And so I think that can sometimes help to put these into perspective, especially because if there's one thing we see in this industry, it's that technology is absolutely here, right? This is not an industry or technology that's going to go away. And so how do we kind of find ways to embrace it and embrace it in ways that are productive rather than destructive? And so then last but not least in this space, we also see AI help with photo editing. This is also historically an issue in online dating, not just the AI part, but concerns about the photos that people choose. Research from back when Match and eHarmony were starting shows that even then, people might choose photos that were a little older, so maybe they look a little younger than they actually are. People, again, years ago, were doing some light edits to those photos. The difference now, right, is just that we're getting help with and from AI. So what I have here is just an example of Canva's AI tool because so many people have adopted Canva, they're using it. And now the difference is not just like, oh, well, maybe someone's making themselves look a little better, but maybe they're actually changing, like we see here, changing some of what's going on in the background. And you might say, like, well, why do we care what's going on in the background? But in my research, what I consistently find is that people look to photos to verify that someone kind of is and does what they say they do and who they say they are. And so what that means is the classic example is a lot of people will put in their profiles, that they like hiking or they like being outdoors. And so then when that's written in the profile, a user will say, okay, I want to see photos of this person outdoors. I want to see photos of them hiking, right? And if they don't have that, then it feels like a violation or like maybe what they typed isn't aligning with kind of who they are. And so now with AI, we could be changing backgrounds. We could be making it look like we're doing things that we aren't actually doing. And so this is a massive tension point in this space right now. Big questions around just the ethical nature of AI. And again, this isn't just in online dating, but when we think about it in online dating, we have to think, is it ethical to, have technology help me with that opening line? Maybe, maybe not. How much is the AI helping? But beyond that, there are also just ethical questions about the environmental impact of AI. If there's one thing we've seen, it's just how much energy and power AI takes. And so, sometimes it's like, well, is it really worth a bottle of water to have an opening line that's, a word or two better than what maybe you would have originally written? I also think an interesting question here and something that I plan to tackle in future research is just when do you disclose that you used AI? So if AI helped you to write an opening line or it helped you to respond to maybe a challenging question, when do you tell a partner that that is what helped you? Do you tell them? And if you don't tell them, how does that make you feel? Do you feel like you're hiding something? Another really big question with the use of AI in this space is the difference between meeting someone in real life or staying virtual, right? Because if you're staying virtual, it becomes a lot easier to kind of rely on the AI. And maybe it doesn't feel so bad because you're not escalating that relationship beyond the digital. But when you meet in real life and you don't have that AI helper anymore, that could become very apparent very quickly. And that goes back to that question of disclosure. And something else I'm really interested in this space is how this might vary by relationship type. So some of my other work in online dating has just looked at how people kind of approach it when they're looking for something more casual versus more serious. And one of the biggest things that I have found actually is people who are looking for more casual relationships tend to be more likely to sext, so to exchange sexually explicit content with one another. But just so to give you an idea, right, there are other variations by relationship type in this space, and I think that we'll see that with AI as well. So the last thing that I want to give you just some ideas about are, what is the future of this, right? Like it, again, can feel a little uncanny, I think, for some people, or maybe a little unsettling. And I think one of the big things that we're going to see in the coming years, if not, now, are more and more virtual environments for first dates, first meetings. People are already jumping from Tinder to things like FaceTime or Zoom so that they can see each other without necessarily having to meet in person. I think kind of the next thrust of that is something that is a little more immersive. So, maybe you're in your Oculus, you're in your headset and able to engage. But we're also seeing increases around avatars that can meet in these online spaces. But what I think could be really difficult with that is like you're getting to a point where it's like, oh, well, my bot will chat with your bot. And if our bots get along, then we can actually talk to each other. And I think this is something to always be aware of, right? Whether you're online dating or just kind of on the internet, is more and more bots are around. And so, how many bots are just interacting with each other? The other thing, though, is that I think we're also going to see a push away from some tech. And that's part of why Match Group has struggled to a point, is that especially among younger generations, Gen Z, there's a sense that, everything has been online. Like, we're extremely online. I'm extremely online. Maybe we need to put our phones down. Maybe we need to have some interactions and activities that aren't confined to technology. And for a lot of people, dating is kind of the logical option to say, you know what, I want a human touch and I don't want technology to interfere. And so, all of that to say is that I have a lot of study ideas and a lot more coming, and plenty more, hopefully, to talk about in a near future. So, like I said, I wanted to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A. I'm very excited to hear what questions you might have. I also just want to mention that you can, if you have questions that we don't get to, or study ideas, whatever the case may be, you can always email me. I have a Substack where I write about my research. I'm working on a piece about AI right now. And you can connect with me on pretty much any major platform. And I wrote a book on sexting. So again, happy to talk about all of these different things. Thank you again for taking the time to be here.
First, I just want to give a huge thank you to Katy for this wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for putting this all together and for sharing your research with us. We have some great questions to get to, so I'm just going to jump right in.
Awesome.
So the first one is, if you had to pick one dating app behavior you'd love to see users abandon in their dating app practices, what would it be? Some examples provided were ghosting, breadcrumbing, etc.
Ooh, what a great question. And as you were asking it, I thought of multiple. I think I'm gonna cheat and I'm gonna say two. I think one that I would like people to do less of is that compulsive checking. I think learning when to kind of put your phone down, or like limiting time on the apps, can help you to be more intentional. And I think that's really critical for a successful dating app experience, right? Is saying like, oh, I'm not just spending all my time on this, or I'm not like kind of looking mindlessly at all these people, but instead focusing and remembering that there are people, right? These are other people on the other side of that screen. And then second, I would definitely say ghosting. I think ghosting is unhealthy. And I think it's unhealthy because it kind of gives people an easy out. And I think it can lead to other negative behaviors from technology. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying to someone, you know what, hey, I this isn't for me. Like, this isn't a great connection. And that might be really scary, but I think it's a good practice to embrace.
Absolutely. Another question is, in your research, did users share in their feedback with you if they would actually disclose AI usage to their partners voluntarily?
Great question. So that hasn't come up yet. I'm working on a couple AI studies right now, and it's been really interesting because I feel like we're still at the point where people are kind of figuring out if they're going to integrate it, and if so, what that's going to look like. So I haven't had anything come up yet about actually voluntarily disclosing. I do think that's going to have to be its own separate study, because I think there are a lot of different things that could come into play with that. For instance, I think social anxiety could be a huge one, right? So if you're worried about how someone might judge you or react to you, maybe you're more likely to use AI, but then maybe that also makes you more nervous about disclosing it. So that to me is like, I think that's a study for later this year.
Another question. Um, are you truly excited? Is there anything you're truly excited about as new dating apps enter the market and new product offerings evolve? Excuse me.
These are really good, good questions. Um, I mean, I think one of the things I am most excited about, or I don't even know if excited or just hopeful about, is tech that allows people kind of that mix of online interaction with offline interaction. So, where is the tech that facilitates, maybe an initial meeting online, but then also meeting in person? Because I think, like I said, one of the big trends is just that people are going to step away from tech, especially for something that is so personal where we expect that human touch. And so where's the app that kind of finds that middle ground where you can use it and say like, okay, here's this person I'm really excited about. Now let me make a plan with them. Especially because in a lot of research, not just my own, one of the biggest struggles in online dating is people who will match and they'll talk for a long time and they essentially become pen pals without meeting in person. And so that's something I am very curious about. And again, I don't know if excited because I don't know that there are many apps that are quite there yet, but I think they're going to have to be as we've kind of watched trends, especially around Gen Z and the fact that they tend to be the highest users of these apps.
Hmm. Actually, this next question really kind of dovetails nicely into to your response there, which is, given the concerns around authenticity and misrepresentation, have you researched or thought about the role of video dating or video speed dating, something like a 5 to 10 minute video call, chemistry check before actually meeting up in person?
Absolutely. And it's been interesting because there are really interesting differences between people who are open to video communication and those who aren't. So, for some people, especially younger people, there's a sense that the phone number, anything associated with the phone number, is maybe more private, more personable. It kind of creates a sense of access that maybe they don't want someone to have right away. And so there's more hesitation around FaceTime, texting, all those kinds of things. Whereas older adults tend to say, like, yeah, I definitely want to just like do this quick kind of video chat. Like, I'd rather know what I'm getting into and take advantage of that before meeting in person. I think speed dating is a really interesting idea for this space. Um, it's interesting because when you look at the online dating or just dating research, there was a lot about a decade ago that focused on speed dating and kind of using speed dating as an experimental setup. And we've kind of gotten away from that with the fact that we have online dating, but I think there's room for it to make a comeback um, and as a research vehicle. And I think that could be really interesting to play with. As kind of an additional note on that, some of my other research has found that people tend to have more positive outcomes from video interactions. So, for example, when I have talked to people, surveyed them, and interviewed them about sexting, like the book, um, that comes up a lot. That people who are sexting via FaceTime or sending videos back and forth, they tend to feel a lot better about their partner, about their relationship. And so I think we could apply some of those findings to online dating and say, you know what, when you're taking even just 5 minutes to see what the other person's like, to get that chemistry check, you're probably going to come away happier.
Hmm. So a little bit of a pivot. I'm not sure if this has come up in your research or not, but have you seen any differences in pre-COVID versus post-COVID usage of dating apps and actually video, I'm sure, in there too?
Oh, yeah. So great question. I started doing my research into online dating in like 2016 or so. So I've witnessed kind of the whole spectrum from when people were maybe more hesitant about it in like 2016, 2017. There was a lot of stigma. And then once COVID happened, it was fascinating to see what changes took place. So really interesting differences. I actually collected data in April of 2020, which I'm still like really proud of. And so I was able to look and see that there were some interesting differences. So some people who were looking for like a serious romantic relationship in April of 2020, they were really like excited about dating apps at that time because what they felt was that they could take that time, kind of like I said earlier, right? Like take the time to be intentional. They could focus on someone's profile, they could message people, and like they felt like it wasn't so weird to spend a little more time messaging or to maybe exchange like Instagram or text messaging. And so those serious relationship seekers were like, this is awesome. Again, not COVID overall, but just the fact that they felt like they could really take time and there wasn't a stigma associated with it. On the other hand, people who were looking for something casual, they were like, you know what? I'm not gonna lie, I'm not gonna beat around the bush. Like I want to sex with someone. Like I'm isolated, I'm bored, I don't have a partner, I don't want something serious, but I really want to have sex or something approximating sex. And so they were much more open to just kind of like jumping into that. And I thought that was interesting because it was also, in a way, it's a safety. measure, because you're not meeting up with a stranger during a pandemic. You're not hooking up with a stranger who you don't know what kind of precautions they've taken. And so it was really interesting to see those differences based on, kind of what people were seeking. I will say there were some people who were like, you know what, if I meet someone really great during this time, like I don't care, I'm going to meet them in person. But that was a really small portion of the people surveyed. But there were still some who were like, you know what, if it's meant to be right now, it's meant to be right now.
Absolutely. And I just do want to put in one final call for questions. We have a few left, but we have a time for a few others. If anyone has any additional questions, please put them in that Q&A function. So another question, are there online dating behaviors that have translated over to in-person dating communications for better or for worse?
Definitely. I mean, I think some of that is kind of what I talked about with that sense of idealization, right? So when you're feeling really optimistic about someone and then you meet them in person, you're kind of keeping them on a pedestal and you're expecting them to act, exactly the way not just exactly the way they did online, but exactly the way they did in your head. And that
Mm,
to me is like a really interesting conundrum where you're you have a screen that you're working with, but then you're also working with your own imagination. And that can be really difficult then when you're actually meeting someone and saying like, "Oh, you're not quite doing what I thought you would, but that's really on me." I mean, you don't really see people going on dates and like not talking to each other, right? Or like being really negative with each other. Like I think a lot of people think like, oh, maybe some people are showing up and then they're just like pulling out their phone or they're ghosting. And I don't think you're seeing things that are that extreme. I think it's much more in the disconnect between how people perceived each other online versus then how they see each other in person. And that's not to say, right? Like people still have bad dates. Bad dates happen and they happen with or without online dating. So I think that's also an element as well.
absolutely. And just to build off of that, there was a question about privacy concerns and if AI has kind of made dating more or less safe, in your opinion.
Ooh, I have some hot takes. So I try to focus a lot on privacy in my work. It's something I usually measure perceptions of or will ask people about because I think there's so much variation. And one of the things I find really interesting in this space is the kind of tension between, do you trust a person, right? Like a person that you're messaging, that you matched with, versus do you trust a company? And something I try to remind my students and now all of you about is that, right, these are companies. Tinder, Hinge, Match Group, right? They're companies. And so I would argue that AI is probably making us a little less private, right? Because your data is going to be used in all kinds of ways. And that's why I like to spend time talking about the algorithm and kind of showing how it works because the algorithm is working based on your activity. And so I think it's really, important for people as online daters, but also just as social media users to think about, what do you want companies to have access to? What are you comfortable with? And I know for a lot of people, especially I hear it from my students all the time, they're like, yeah, I don't care. Like it's just the way it is. But I don't know that you have to feel that way. And I think it's important to remember that, you have agency and you can say like, you know what, I don't want this site to know this about me, or I want these cookies off on this website. I don't think we have to take for granted that there's no privacy left in our online world.
Absolutely. And oh, hold on, another question just came in. So we have two more questions, if
Oh,
that's okay.
absolutely.
So I just lost it. I really apologize. Here we go. Okay. What strategies can one use to keep the habitual use of technology when dating app companies are monetarily incentivized to gamify dating apps and create addictive behaviors with their users?
Oh, I know. It's such a struggle. And it's a struggle, again, not just with online dating. Like, don't ask me why. Like, I still scroll Twitter. It's terrible. But I think one of the best things that you could do as a technology user, especially as an online dater, is to really set aside time where you know that that's what you're going to do. And to really pay attention to how much time you're spending on the apps. And that sounds really basic, but all of us know, it's really easy to lose time when you're on your phone, when you're scrolling on TikTok, Instagram, any of these. Um, and I mean, it might be as serious as saying, like, okay, what time is it when I'm opening Tinder? Do I make a note of it? and what time do I want to be done with it. And I think that's just a key part of this, is saying like, do I have a specific time? Do I have a specific amount of time? And feeling that, I think it's also important to know that, it's okay to put it down. I feel like we have this sense that as soon as someone messages us, we need to respond right away. Um, or as soon as we get a notification, we need to know what it is. And that's simply not true. And so, when you get a notification from a dating app being like, you know what, I can let that sit, I can wait, because maybe it's going to change your life, but if it's going to change your life, it's going to happen whenever you open it, right? It's not a matter of, I need it this minute. And so I think kind of reframing how we think about the pressure of a notification on our phone or receiving a message. I think that's like a really critical part of this as well, is just saying like, okay, you know what, I'm changing how I'm thinking about this. Again, something I also absolutely struggle with. Like I totally get it, but I think it's part of the journey.
I do too, absolutely. Um, this last question is kind of asking about the difference in experiences between the customer experience between people who are using dating apps for trying to find a more serious relationship and maybe those who are looking for more casual relationships, and if that's something that came up in your research at all.
Really interesting. So when we talk about it from that consumer perspective, it doesn't seem that different, because when I first started digging into this, especially as the subscription model, really started taking off, I kind of anticipated that maybe more serious relationship seekers would be maybe more willing to pay, and that is just simply not the case. There are a lot more differences, obviously, based on like socioeconomic status, also just where people live. So one thing I have tended to notice is that if you live in a city, you're much more likely to pay, and that kind of makes sense because you have a bigger pool. Before I was at BU, I worked at South Dakota State, and so I actually got to see what it was like for people using dating apps in a rural area, and it is really different because you definitely know that you have a limited dating pool, and it feels really hard to justify paying for some of the features when, that same group of people is kind of literally everywhere. But when we look at the relationship type, all kinds of people are willing to pay or not, or are feeling burned out or not, because someone who wants something casual, they might really have like an idea of what it is they're looking for, especially if it's just for a night, right? Like there's a sense of urgency that maybe a serious relationship seeker doesn't have, but they're looking for something, still different that they are also willing to pay for. So that has been really interesting to watch. And again, especially post COVID and the kind of growth of the subscription model, a lot more to do with socioeconomic and where people live.
I do want to sneak in one more question. I know we're
Yeah.
running up against time, but it actually has a lot to do with kind of what you just touched on there, which is that this person who submitted the question mentions that they've heard that the consumer that a lot of dating apps are kind of built around is men, is specifically on those heterosexual match um, apps, because they are more likely to pay for a service. Did your research find this to be true? And what suggestions do you have for women on apps if that is true?
Yes. Yeah, consistently. Really fascinating, like how consistently this holds true, that there tend to be more men on the apps. They tend to be more willing to pay. Um, and so for women, and again, this is talking about typically, straight cisgender. Um, I know there's so much we could talk about. So if you want to know more about like LGBTQ, you can always email me. Like we could do a whole other webinar on it. But for women who are dating, kind of knowing, right, that there are more men out there, I think that just kind of furthers the need to really be intentional and to pay attention. But also, just because someone is paying for the app, that doesn't mean you have to act a certain way, right? Like you don't owe someone because they paid a company for access to you. And that's one of my biggest concerns with the subscription models, is what happens when one person is a paying customer and the other isn't, right? Like it's not on the non-paying customer to kind of rise to the occasion. It's on the app to rise to the occasion. And so I think those are really important things to remember. And, at the end of the day, you can always block someone. I'm a big fan of the block tool. But so I think that's important to remember. But also then as a woman, typically as a straight woman, you typically do have more options. And so I think that's something I see a lot, where people are like, oh, I'm just never going to find someone. Like, you will. There are plenty of people out there. And so, don't settle.
Absolutely. Well, Katy, I just want to thank you for sharing your time and expertise today in this incredible webinar today. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us, especially those who continue to support our students and the university through your donations. As Alex mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available for on-demand viewing on the Alumni and Friends website, again, found at www.bu.edu/alumni. We hope you all have a great day or a great evening wherever you are tuning in from. And thank you so much.